So, welcome everyone to the food history seminar for today. Thank you for coming along. And as per usual, please do feel free to add any kind of comments or thoughts or questions into the chat, and we will sort of ask them in the room for you at the time, or you can raise your hand and talk on the camera as well. So either way is perfectly fine. So I'm really pleased to have Simon Trafford here, who I used to work with back in the day. And he works at the IHR, so we actually have a proper IHR presence for today's seminar, which is quite rare these days. So Simon is a senior lecturer in medieval history at the Institute of Historical Research. He has published extensively on modern popular uses and appropriations of the Vikings, and that includes a chapter on alcohol consumption, masculinity, and the modern Viking, which was published last year in 2024 in the Routledge volume Viking Heritage and History in Europe, edited by Sarah Ellis Nielsen and Stefan Nizel. Today's paper develops the arguments there, but concentrates particularly on honey-based alcohol and is entitled Drinking with the Vikings, the Case of Mead. Now, I'm a big fan of mead. I like to drink mead, so I'm looking forward to hearing about its history a bit further. So with no further ado, over to you, Simon, and we'll come back at the end for some questions.
Thanks very much indeed, Matt. Thank you, and thank you everybody for coming along. So I'll just share my slides, hopefully. Now I think that is the one. Hopefully that should be a slide with my title slide with some rather fetching bottles of mead on it.
Yep,
Is
that's
that
working.
that
Yep.
is splendid. Thank you very much indeed. So, mead is an alcoholic beverage with an alcoholic strength of between 8 and 18%, which is the result of fermentation by yeasts of honey diluted by water. But honey-based beverages are a broad camp, and there are many different styles and types according to the different flavorings and ingredients added, meaning that the broad term covers a multitude of different drinks with a great variety of strengths, sweetnesses, and tastes. Hopefully, hold on, let me just trying to get my slides to advance. Yes, I think that has now advanced. Um, I hear a variety of different styles, types of honey-based alcoholic drinks, hydromel, sack mead, piment, cider, but various with various different recipes, various different combinations of honey-based alcohol. Some mead, for sure, is sweet. But there's no reason why the range of tastes and sweetnesses possible is any narrower in a glucose-based alcohol, such as mead, than in maltose-based alcohol, such as beer and ale, or fructose-based alcohol, such as wine. I'll generally be treating all honey-based alcohols together, though, and simply calling them mead for convenience. In this paper, I want to look at the rather odd status that mead has, certainly in the Anglosphere, probably in most of Europe, and to an extent in the rest of the world, as a drink that feels as though it is from another time, that is well before the industrial or post-industrial present, and perhaps is best located in the first millennium, or at least in a fantastic or fairy tale version thereof. I will look at the way in which mead has become associated with the Vikings in the popular imagination, and go on to consider the Renaissance in mead production in the 21st century, and the interesting dilemma now facing meaderies in trying to imagine an identity for honey-based alcohol as a mainstream and global product, namely to Viking or not to Viking. To start off, though, I want briefly to plunge back, far before the Vikings, into the prehistoric past. A claim that is often made of mead is that it is the oldest alcoholic drink. And this could well be correct. Humanity's first encounters with alcohol are more likely than not to have been accidental or serendipitous. It may have been the sugars of some rotten fruit or a container of honey onto which rain had fallen, from which first fermented the first alcohol to pass the surprised and then delighted lips of a human being. In any event, it almost certainly happened far back in prehistory, before the written record, prior even to the development of agriculture, and almost certainly in multiple places around the world. Ancient honey-based alcohol is, it should be emphasized, a commonplace of everywhere that honeybees can naturally be found, that is, Eurasia and Africa. I note that although there were native bees in the Americas and Australia that produced smaller quantities of honey, Europeans were responsible for the introduction of Apis mellifera, the European honeybee that produces honey in far greater abundance and really makes possible something like mead. Pottery vessels containing mixtures of honey, rice, and fruit, together with organic compounds indicative of fermentation, have been found in China, dating to the early Neolithic, 7000 BC. There are convincing references to the production of mead in ancient Egypt and among the Bronze Age Hittites. Far less convincingly, it has been suggested that the divine Soma, mentioned in the Sanskrit Rig Veda of the 2nd millennium BCE, may be mead. But there's no reason to doubt the general picture that mead production was widespread in Europe, the Mediterranean, and the rest of the world for centuries and indeed millennia before the birth of Christ. Mead is, we can say with confidence, a very ancient product. That said, though, beer and wine are also phenomenally old drinks, with evidence for beer brewing stretching back up to 8,000 years, and also appearing in Egypt and a multitude of other ancient contexts. The fermentation of honey is, for sure, a simpler process than the process of malting grain before it can be brewed as beer. So it may be that mead production began earlier in human history. But brewing of all sorts is extremely ancient, and this basis for the supposed unique antiquity of honey-based alcohol, as opposed to grain or fruit alcohols, swiftly falls apart under the slightest scrutiny. Perhaps mead does slightly predate beer and wine, but given that they are all very old indeed, this does not in itself constitute a reason. Sorry, I've just lost my place. Constitute a reason for the fact that mead is normally thought of as old or of another time. With that said, let's move to the era that is certainly a lot more important to its modern image, namely the early Middle Ages. Here we need to look to the common Northern European culture of the mead hall that has been explored by Michael Enright, Stephen Pollington, and many others, as evidenced in Old English, Irish, and Welsh poetry and in Scandinavian saga. I'm not going to say terribly much about this as this is firmly available elsewhere, but a few points do need to be made. Mead hall culture revolved around the distribution and consumption of food and drink by a lord to his followers as a reward for loyalty and services performed, and as down payment on services in the future. Feasting and revelry in the ceremonial setting of a large building designed for the purpose, the mead hall, seems to have been a focus for group and individual identity formation across much of the first millennium, as well as providing a forum for poetry, the recital and remembrance of deeds, and the forging and renewal of bonds of loyalty between a leader and his warband and between the members of the band themselves. This is all very well known, and as I say, there's no need or time now to go into the details, but we see it as a constant theme of heroic literature and poetry right across Northern Europe in Irish, Welsh, English, and Scandinavian culture. We see its material components in such burial deposits as Sutton Hoo, Prittlewell, and Taplow. So here from Sutton Hoo, we see the hanging bowl from the 7th century ship burial in Mound 1, and reconstructed drinking horns based on the horn mounts. From Taplow in Buckinghamshire, also of the 7th century, again, 2 more horn mounts, which are among 19 excavated vessels for drinking and feasting. And here from Prittlewell in Essex, from the late 6th or very early 7th century burial, we see glass vessels, another hanging bowl, and a wooden drinking bottle with a decorated gold neck. Particularly eye-catching, of course, are the mighty horns, normally aurochs or cattle horns, which are an instantly recognizable symbol of this culture and visible here on these picture stones from Gotland. On the left, the Tengelgårda stone and Stenkirke on the right. Both neither necessarily particularly closely datable, but possibly from the Viking Age, certainly first millennium. The consumption of strong drink in considerable quantities is a central feature of the mead hall, as the name would suggest, be it anywhere in Northern Europe. But a range of drinks, perhaps contrary to the idea conveyed by this word mead hall, by which it's normally now known, a range of drinks seem to have been consumed with a notable hierarchy of esteem. In Beowulf, we come across Medu, Ealu, Beor, and Wyn. Sometimes, although not necessarily equated correctly with mead, ale, beer, and wine, respectively. It's hard to tell exactly what these terms describe, but Beor is rather more likely to have been a fruit-based drink, perhaps cider. It's perhaps that it was only rather later that the word beer, or beer, was commandeered to mean barley-based alcohol flavored with hops, and thereby distinguished from ale, barley-based alcohol flavored with grout or a mixture of herbs and botanicals, probably bog myrtle, yarrow, marsh rosemary, and others. Of these drinks, wine and mead seem, to judge by the Old English evidence, to have been harder to obtain, more valuable, and perhaps more likely to be restricted to the upper echelons of the social hierarchy. Nevertheless, as Anne Hagen has shown in England and Wales, mead appears not just in the heroic world of Beowulf, but in the more workaday world of the chronicles and food rents. There's every reason to think that, although mead was a higher status and presumably rarer and more expensive drink in the British Isles, it was nonetheless reasonably readily obtainable everywhere throughout Britain. There are, though, some indications that this may not have been the case in Scandinavia. Mead appears in Scandinavia in two very high-profile contexts. Firstly, as the mead of poetry that could bestow the skills of a poet or a scholar on anyone who drank it, and that was famously stolen by Othin from the giant Suttungr and his daughter Gunnlöth. That's one. And secondly, mead as produced in vast quantities by the udders of the goat Heithrun that lived on the roof of Valhalla. And this mead was then served by the Valkyria, the Valkyries, to the most honourable of the dead gathered in Valhalla, the Einherjar. But as Jesus Guerrero Rodriguez argues in his 2007 York PhD thesis, mead appears in Scandinavian sources to be placed far more in an idealized otherworldly realm, in Eddic and Skaldic poetry, rather than in the real world. It doesn't appear very often in the saga corpus, as opposed to the poetic corpus, and it doesn't really seem to appear in many of the tools and concepts. The tools and concepts associated with drinking compounds in Mjotha, in mead, are relatively few and far between, whereas those in Öl are far more abundant. Inasmuch as we can tell, then, the drinking of mead may have been talked about in medieval Scandinavia rather more often than it was actually done. But for the purposes of those who would later use these sources to form an idea of Viking culture, the fact that the consumption of mead is such a central part of the idealized good life of Valhalla was all that mattered. In the later Middle Ages, and especially the early modern period, in northwestern Europe at least, the fortunes of mead went into a decline. The relatively expensive raw material on which it depended, honey, meant that it was unable to compete with large-scale industrial production of beer and wine and spirits. Judith M. Bennett's important 1996 study, Ale, Beer and Brewsters in England, showed how beer production changed its character in the later Middle Ages and early modern period after a technical innovation. The widespread introduction of hops led to improved keeping qualities of beer and opened up the possibility of industrialized and remunerative large-scale production. From having been a largely domestic and small-scale craft, mostly in the hands of women, brewing turned into a much more centralized industry dominated by men. That's another story about which there is much to be said. But for my present purposes, the significant point is that the new approach to beer production fundamentally changed the economics and dynamics of alcohol production and consumption as a whole, and ensured that mead could not compete. Honey itself, which had held the position of the sole sweetener available to first millennium Europe, was challenged and then supplanted by imported sugarcane and later sugar beet. Mead's disappearance was not, however, even across Europe, and in some places, notably in the Baltic states and parts of Iberia, it clung on as an everyday drink, with production occurring both domestically in the home and in dedicated meaderies. Although, so far as I can tell, this tended to be localized and on a relatively small scale. And here I would have to admit that my perspective is very much that of Northwestern Europe, and I would be heartily glad to hear from anyone who can provide further information on other regions. Though mead almost entirely vanished as a drink one would be likely to encounter in pubs, bars, or shops, the idea of it remained present, though, as from the 16th and 17th century onwards, Europe rediscovered and lionized its heroic barbarian past, with the culture of the mead hall at its centre. Again, it's necessary to summarize a complex historical development and historical and cultural development very swiftly. But as various literatures, such as Beowulf, the Norse myths, or the Mabinogion or Godothin, became available to a reading public, the high status and alleged importance of mead to those societies became fixed in the romantic historical imagination. So it's this period, I suggest, that is crucial in establishing mead very firmly as a drink from another age that is definitely not the present. The act of drinking mead, to this way of thinking, is by definition historicizing and conjures up imagery of a long distant and yet comfortably familiar past. Though we may enjoy mead for its intrinsic merits and taste, there is an eye on the heroic barbarian past that is ever present. It feels like a drink appropriate to feasts and revelry in the mead hall style, and perhaps best served in a horn rather than a more normal drinking container. There's a contrast to be drawn here with beer. As we've seen, though honey-based alcoholic beverages may in fact be older than grain-based, they're both extremely old and date back into prehistory. Equally, grain and fruit-based alcohols were probably at least as prevalent, if not more so, in most historical mead halls than honey-based, the mead itself. But beer, in the present, also has a multitude of more recent cultural reference, not least since at least the 18th century, through industrial production on a massive scale that make it beer clearly also of the modern world. Of course, beer can and frequently is marketed with reference to heritage in the past. Noel Phillips's 2019 study of craft beer culture and modern medievalism, for instance, has shown how the new wave of craft beer producers in the United States and Canada in the 21st century have frequently adopted monastic medievalism and militant medievalism, generally in the form of the Vikings, in constructing identities for their efforts. And similar arguments can be extended right across the world. But beer is advertised in many other ways besides this sort of medievalizing, and does not have anywhere near the sense that it is from another time that mead does, especially with that feeling that of the past that mead evokes seems generally to be a rather distant one. And so now I want to come very much into the present day, and talk about um, the branding of mead nowadays, which I think has shown a really huge change over the last 40 years or so, more perhaps more, a little more than that. In the late 20th century, the largest, indeed almost the only producer of mead in the UK was Lindisfarne Mead, established in 1968 at St Aidan's Winery in the middle of the village on Holy Island, medieval Lindisfarne, and marketed using a faux medieval typeface and artwork that is quite clearly based on the Lindisfarne Gospels. The associations were never especially well defined, but clearly there was an aim to be monastic and perhaps fuzzily Celtic. Uh, in 1979, Lindisfarne Mead was joined by another UK producer, Moniac Mead, based in the 16th century Moniac Castle near Inverness in Scotland. The label is again evocative of a none too well defined and thoroughly misty past, with a Gothic font and a picture of the tower of Moniac Castle. And I note here that that Moniac Castle's tower was crenellated in 1804 in the full flood of Strawberry Hill Gothic. So we have medievalism in this case piled upon medievalism of different periods. Through the 1980s, Mead, in the UK at least, meant one or another of these, meant Lindisfarne or Moniac, and their producers did rather well out of their rarity value. Rather more recently, however, things have started to change, and mead production has undergone a renaissance. There are complicated reasons for this. First of all, I would say the growth overall of heritage tourism, of Ren fairs in the United States, and living history experiences, medieval festivals, and medieval markets in Europe, especially the large Mittelaltermärkte in Central Europe. Mead is a frequent accompaniment to the sorts of banquets and feasts that they offer. And to participatory heritage in general, in particular reenactment, which is very much enjoying a boom in the 21st century. Secondly, I'd point to the explosive expansion of craft and artisan beer production in the United States in the 21st century, and following in its wake from in the rest of the world as well. But it's notable that mead has also taken off as a result of that artisan craft beer production. From around 30 meaderies existing in the US in 2003, by 2016 there were over 300, and this has been catching on right around the world. Thirdly, I would note what I'd call the 21st century Viking turn. The huge popularity of the History Channel's The Vikings show and of HBO's show Game of Thrones, although there is no actual mead in Game of Thrones, but everybody seems to think that there is, because there should be. I note also Skyrim, the computer game released 2011, which has sold well over 60 million copies, and which heavily features as a constituent part of the culture of its Nord culture, Black Briar Mead on the screen here, and Honningbrew Mead. Furthermore, I would suggest that the cultural ubiquity of Vikings has been enabled by the internet, and really has built into a massive money-making and branding exercise that can be used to whatever purpose it is needed, mead being one of those purposes. So I would note here the Viking feasts that we have at typical Viking festivals. On my slide here, top left, is the audience at Midgardsblot, the annual Viking rock and culture festival, which takes place at Borre alongside the Iron Age and Viking Age burial mounds, and is actually organized by the Borre Viking Center. Bottom left on my screen there is the Jorvik Viking Festival. I mean, note all of the sort of the heartiness, the horns, everything that is going on here. I also note the right-hand slide is the Valhalla Festival, a newcomer which is just outside Basingstoke, slightly surprisingly. But this is an omnipresent theme. Um, as I say, taking advantage of this ultimate saleability of the Vikings. Uh, we can see this then here on the Viking lifestyle site, Grimfrost. I find it extraordinary that there is such a thing as a Viking lifestyle site, and there are numerous Viking lifestyle sites. This one owned by Johan Hegg, the lead singer and frontman of Amon Amarth, the world's biggest Viking metal band, and somewhere that promises to provide for all your Viking needs, from drinking horns to t-shirts to Thor's hammers to beard oil. Here we see a rather relaxed looking Viking chilling after his morning's pillaging with some tins of mead. Um, but I would also go on to uh, note the ubiquity of Viking mead from around the world. So some of this, for instance, this is Lancashire mead from Vikings blood mead, Shetland Scald. Um, I note this hoodie. There's all sorts to deal with here to unpack with this particular hoodie, but produced by a meadery in Somerset. Um, then hammered horn mead, horn mead, hammered honey of Texas. Four Brothers mead of Missouri. Three Horns Vikings blood mead of here of Victoria, Australia. Obviously, in Scandinavia itself, Mjødgard of Denmark, Viking Miklagard mead of Norway, Valhalla mead of Stavanger. But it's not just Northern Europe. So we have this Ragnarok mead of Austria, Methammer Valkurenblut of Switzerland, and then but going even further afield, into places that have their own independent mead traditions. Hydromel Odin of Spain, Valhalla Hydromel of Spain. Um, Even going further afield, Valhalla Hydromiel of Costa Rica, or Norseman mead of Brazil, or Freya Hydromiel of Mexico. Really interesting. These places that have their own independent mead making traditions, but that Viking branding is being used because of the ubiquity of Vikings in popular culture. This has also led to some further, I think, perhaps rather unlikely consequences. So, Lindisfarne mead, poor old Lindisfarne mead, which for so long was the only one on the market, has now found itself outflanked and outsold by a host of competitors flaunting their sexy Viking branding. The response has been for Lindisfarne mead to go Viking. Although it continues to produce its classic product using very much the same branding that it ever had, Lindisfarne now also produces various Viking themed meads, which, given that one of the opening dramas of the Viking Age in England was the sack of Lindisfarne in June 793, there's a huge irony to this. Um, it seems very curious. Um, Another point to make, though, although the Vikings are by some considerable way the medieval culture most frequently cited in mead branding, they're not the only one, as can be seen in this rather striking example of a gift set produced by another medieval lifestyle website, Horns of Odin. Here, hopefully you can see on the left, Loki's Curse mead for the Viking inclined, whereas for the Celtic inspired, on the right, there is mead of Cernunnos. In this highly commodified world of purchasable pre-modern fantasizing, you pays your money and takes your choice of whichever essentially identical product happens to please you with the pre-modern branding that corresponds with your aspirations. However, although I've been concentrating on these pre-modern or ancient branded meads, it would be quite incorrect to say that the entirety of the contemporary mead boom has chosen this direction. On the contrary, there are a very appreciable number of meaderies that take a very different direction and try to shake off Mead's connotations, which tend to be of reenactors, of folk fans, of a certain age, and perhaps most likely male. Rather, they want to market Mead far more widely to a much wider age range and a more varied demographic. Essentially, they're pushing it as an alcopop, but a healthy one, on the rather spurious grounds that it contains natural ingredients, that is to say, honey rather than refined sugar. They make use of a far more diverse range of thematic branding, some of it centered on bees' naturalness and purity, but also making use of the common ground of popular culture of one sort or another. So we see then something like Gosnells of London, which very much features bees as its common theme. We see bee nectar of the US, which is for some reason here using an AT-AT from Star Wars as its particular theme, or which uses the zombies taking Manhattan, but also with bees on its labels. We see a fascinating one here. Summer Isle Mead from Apothecary in the UK, making use of the folk horror boom in the UK, again to market it, to position its particular product as something a bit different. Or we see this Kinsale Mead from Ireland, or its Mountain Mead from Wales, again pushing Mead as something natural and different and refined and sophisticated. Um, I'd also point to the perhaps a middle path being steered here by English Heritage, long a purveyor of mead in its shops at heritage attractions and elsewhere. Traditionally, that edged towards Celtic branding, but now is of a variety of types, as we see here. I want to end, though, by something which I feel captures the fascinating dilemma in which mead now finds itself, to play upon its traditional image as a drink from the past, which provides a guaranteed but relatively small market of those for whom drinking something that smacks of the pre-modern is an advantage, or to try for a much wider constituency as a more normal drink that sells itself not on its supposed historicism, but on its own virtues. And for this purpose, I want to stop my PowerPoint and just turn instead to an episode of all things of Dragon's Den, the BBC program, television program, in which entrepreneurs look for funding from a number of venture capitalists. And in an episode in last year, which I hope is now showing on your screens. Is that now showing, Matt? Thank you.
Yes, can see that.
I'm actually going to stop sharing because I just want to check that I click the right box to get sound as well. Sorry, apologies. Yeah, that should be all good. So let me just find that again, and I have lost it. Sorry, brief moment whilst I just get that back up. Apologies. Just going to have to. Sorry. So let me just share that. Sorry. Okay. Yeah, so you should be able to see that. I'll just find my place.
Now, Pad has only been trading since October 2019. We have our UK.
Okay. Okay, so let's just start from this point.
Mead. Unfortunately, your numbers don't stack up for an investment from me, and I'm out.
Peter, so my question is, if it is going to become a mainstream product, then why haven't you branded it as such? Because if I saw that bottle on a shelf, I'm asking myself, who does that appeal to? There's some swords on here. There's like a snake with a... I'm thinking Viking people are going to love this.
Yeah.
This looks like a niche product for a niche category.
I completely understand what you're saying, but in that case, people wouldn't be watching Game of Thrones and make it the biggest watched TV show pretty much of all time.
So the people that watch Game of Thrones, you think they go out and buy Viking stuff?
Yeah. Yeah, go out and buy mead, go out and buy swords, go out and buy cloaks.
I've got loads of friends that watch Game of Thrones, including myself, and I've never bought a sword.
Okay.
You'd look good with a sword.
Your case to me is that it's the right decision to keep this branding focused on Vikings because even if this product goes mainstream, the consumer will have an affinity to that. Is that correct?
I believe so. When we're at a food and drink market and there are gins and there are rums and there are whiskies, people naturally are drawn to us because we have big banners up with dragons and things.
So I get that. My thing is, you know, Dave walks into a supermarket or a restaurant, and it's one of the products on the shelf. They don't know the back history of Vikings and Mead and all that. So all of that stuff, I actually think when this is mainstream, it will be lost. It will just be, you know, a story that might exist in your head, but it won't be part of what makes their decision.
Yeah.
I think you're being a little bit too romantic about the Viking thing, especially if this is a wave coming into shore. And I trust you. I don't know. You know this stuff better than me. You know Mead better than me, so maybe it is. But when it comes into shore, your positioning and your branding is really going to matter.
Yeah.
And right now, I don't think you're positioned correctly to ride that wave in.
Okay.
For that reason, I'm going to say that I'm out, but I commend you. And I have to say, it tastes really good.
Thank you very much.
It does taste really good.
Cheers. Thank you.
Okay, so so there we see Peter Taylor of the Nithhogger reenactment group in York, attempting to sell his mead and failing to do so, with that very interesting little conversation with Stephen Bartlett, one of the dragons from Dragon's Den, which I think neatly encapsulates this particular moment of angst, almost for mead producers as they try to decide which way to jump in this particular case. It's worth noting, actually, that since that program, though he didn't get funding for it, its Nithhogger Mead is now stocked in all National Trust shops, and is making a very tidy little profit on that basis. So that jumping that particular way was rather successful in this case. I think that's probably where I want to wrap up. I hope that I hope my points have been made, and yeah, thank you very much indeed.
Brilliant. Thank you, Simon, for that. I'm just going to stop the recording.